from 1989. And
are you familiar with what this song is about, Matt?
it's about Veronica.
It is. Can you tell me anything about
Her name
Veronica?
is Veronica.
Her name was Veronica.
And
Didn't pick up anything?
And her name, no, I didn't. I listened to it
Josh,
once.
did you pick up anything in terms of what you think this song
Is
may
she
be
a
about?
prostitute?
She is not a prostitute by any means.
It is his mother?
It is not his mother, no.
Okay, I'm out of guesses then.
This was a past relationship, correct?
Incorrect. So this song was written
I failed.
actually about an elderly woman, very much modeled on his grandmother who had Alzheimer's, who
Now the
was
video makes
basically
sense.
having her life run in front of her with a series of memories, but they're fleeting and not altogether consistent. Right. And and the video that Matt would have seen was designed to sort of show the idea of that mind that is, I think he said it was like terrifyingly lucid at times, followed by diminished. You know what I'm saying? In the way that anyone who's ever, so that is the thematic area. I will admit that I was able to pick up that it was someone looking back on their life, but I did not get the totality of that from the song lyrics. So that was very interesting to read about that.
Yeah.
I will also mention, Matt, do you recognize the bass player on this album? Or this song,
No,
should
I didn't
say?
look. No.
It's a pretty famous one that you're a stated fan of, and that is one Paul McCartney is the co-writer and bassist on this.
He co-wrote
track.
the song too. I didn't know that.
Yep. So yes, so this one has some heavy songwriting credentials. I believe, I'll check it out, but I believe T-Bone Pickens was also affiliated with this song, if I remember correctly in my
T-Bone
research.
Pickens? T-Bone
think-
Burnett.
T-Bone Burnett. I'm sorry. I mixed it
T-Bone
up with
Pickens
that.
is the billionaire oil tycoon
That's right.
that was
I
running for
mixed it up,
political
yes.
office.
Sorry, my bad. Wrong.
That's T-Boone Pickens.
T-Boone or whatever. Sorry, I don't know why those got. Maybe I'm turning into Veronica. So, anyway, that's what that. Enough history now. Let's go back to how you felt about it. So, Matt,
Well,
give me your thoughts.
this is the first I ever heard of him, and when I saw this video, and this is also at the height of my, music fandom of being basically either hair metal or synth pop. So this, when I first saw it at 10 or 11 years old, did not really fit in either category. And I was like, who's this guy's Elvis? Is he naming himself after Elvis Presley? Because I thought that Elvis Presley might have been the only person actually named Elvis.
And
so.
the answer is yes, he did.
Yeah, well, right, and so, but I was kind of, that's right, I forgot about that. But I was very dismissive of this song and this video as a kid, even though I did see the video. I don't know if I ever sat down when the video came on. I don't think I ever watched the whole thing. I probably flipped the channel not too long after it started, because I didn't really have the attention span, or I didn't really care to. Yeah, I cared to listen to it more. But over the years, I have heard the song even more than just this before this week, and I do like this song. It's it's got a very bouncy kind of upbeat melody. I like the little there's some, I don't know if it's like a synth harpsichord or something that's kind of happening in there that it's a little bit of an 80s sheen, but it's still kind of interesting. And no, it's an upbeat. Now I know the topic, so that's quite sad, but melodically, musically, it's fairly upbeat and catchy. And yeah, I could see why this was a hit. And I guess I would assume that it's a little bit of a resurgence in his career. If only for that song. This album is actually incidentally ranked as his 10th highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. So it's ranked number 598 in the 1980s, number 53 in 1989. So not a highly ranked album, at least as far as this list goes, but I do like the song. So I'm a thumbs up on the Veronica song.
How about you?
Yeah, so I went back and double checked. This year's model was my 9th favorite album of the 70s.
Yeah, I remember you ranked that pretty highly.
I am high, at least for the main feed episodes. And I did watch the video after that. And so based on those stats, Matt, it seems like, the song is not necessarily representative of what the album was like. Or
well, it was just an example.
How it was received.
Yeah, it's just an example of a hit song that
right.
That did quite well, but at least it's Elvis Costello's best album is not. Yeah, he's like
right.
Well, if you want to hear what Elvis Costello was going for, this might help you out a little bit. As his first album for a new label, in his words, Costello had the budget of a small independent movie, and having in mind the blueprint for 5 different albums, decided to make all of them. So that was that's the line from Wikipedia right there. So
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the song. It's a testament to how good of a songwriter he is. It immediately has like a bouncy retro feel to it, which I feel like a lot of his songs have, even back in the early late 70s when we covered those albums. He's always,
you know what song it reminded me of?
What?
Cruel to Be Kind by Nick Lowe. I
Yes.
feel like in this are in the same family.
Oh, and I thought of the like That Thing You Do, that classic song. I think
Yep.
Adam, what's his last name? Who wrote the song?
Schlesinger, Adam Schlesinger.
Yeah, he
Rest
kind
in
of
peace.
has that retro kind of feel to his writing as well.
Power pop. It's
Yeah,
power pop.
exactly. And you can't go wrong with power pop in my mind. And this song was great. So yeah.
Oh,
I
you
love
definitely could go wrong with power pop, but like there's a lot of good power pop.
it.
Too,
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, with the intentionality and the talent that he has, it really worked for me, and it just harkens back to those early 80s albums that he had in terms of what I liked about them. The song captures that as well.
Yep, I'm gonna throw in that I very much like this song. It's like a really good single.
Yep.
And it's in that, as you guys have mentioned, that sort of that power pop. It is not as much tied to sort of the edginess that Elvis Costello had, like angry young manny, edginess, sort of like outsider. This is very much the work of a more mature artist, I feel, in terms of age, right? Writing about something that I would say it doesn't have that sort of that level of cynicism to it. If anything, it's kind of tender in some ways. But it sounds sonically like it should be a love song. And because it's got a female name in it, I think you just think it's going to be a love song, right? But it isn't. And it's not really till you dig it. And I will tell you, in all of the years of singing this song, like when I would do it, I don't think I ever knew what, like it was one of those songs, there aren't many, but one of those songs where I would sing the chorus without knowing the words. I would sing like Michael Stipe, where like I was making sounds without knowing the words, like, if you know, like I never knew what so like when I read the lyrics, I was like, oh, that's really interesting.
Welcome to my world, John.
Well, yeah, it kind of was like being Matt for the first time, but like, I don't know what I thought like it was different words, and I just heard it very different. And I'm not usually a guy that like makes up words. I usually hear them pretty well or get curious about it. So I realized like when I got to the chorus and in my mind started singing along, I'm like, I don't know what the actual words are here. And so as a result, I kind of thought it was cool to see the words of the chorus. Yeah.
It's a great chorus though. It is like his voice is great on. He's got a little harmony with it, and the verses are great too, because it kind of does like this descending thing and then it goes up and it kind of, it's interesting that McCartney co-wrote it, because now that I think about it, it really does make sense that it's kind of really in line with kind of how he approaches a lot of his songwriting. So that's a interesting tidbit.
Well, like everything, like kind of like sings on the exact same scale, right? Like, is it all in that pretty little head of yours? Like everything, no matter how many words are in it, right? It always stays in that cadence. So sometimes he shoves like 14 words in that line, and sometimes he shoves like 4 in that, and draws it out, which I found to be a really interesting way to write a song too, because he just speeds up how fast he says the words, but along that same cadence. So, yeah. But in case anybody's wondering and is in the same spot as me in terms of the chorus is, do you suppose that waiting hands on eyes Veronica has gone to hide, and all the times she laughs at those who shout her name and steal her clothes? That's what leads into the Veronica part, which I would not have guessed. Nope. But when you think about it, that's like talking about the nursing home, right? Shout her name and steal her clothes because she doesn't know. So I was like, oh, interesting. So when you go backwards, right? So
yeah,
very same.
Now in terms of the buzz clips, are they always like the singles off of the albums? Is there a correlation there? Or?
So it is a track. So the buzz clips are like tracks you should know was kind of the idea that MTV
they tend to be
sold
singles
us.
though, because buzz clips were videos and videos were typically singles.
Yeah,
you get the feeling in looking at it that at the beginning MTV was really the ones making that call, and I just feel like over time labels seem to get much better at cultivating a band or a track to get buzzworthy, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It feels
And
it's
it's
a little bit
interesting,
more.
and it's interesting because a lot of buzz clips are newer artists, and this is obviously an older artist that's kind of, making somewhat of a comeback.
Right.
So it's not like Elvis Costello was unknown to the music populace. It was just like, oh, Elvis is back with this really cool song. Here it is.
Well, and throughout the
you should listen
90s,
to it.
most would be new artists, but then there would always be one who was like an old, like you'll see like a Morrissey song, right, in 1994, or you'll see a Bob Dylan song in 1997. I think that I saw one where it was like, there was a Cocteau Twins song in like 1993, right? So there's occasionally like older groups, new stuff, right, comes in. But yeah, as Matt said, it's mostly new artists, like you ought to know type stuff. Yeah. So
Well, it's crazy too that I was just looking at Elvis Costello. We covered Get Happy in 1980, and he's now put out 8 albums in the rest of the decade that we haven't covered.
I
so-
know Imperial Bedroom, right, is well regarded. That's one that was there.
But yeah, that's crazy. He just continued on despite us not covering him.
An album a year, basically,
Yep.
for seemingly forever. To this day, it feels
I know.
like he was doing an album a year. Yeah. So he just had so much to say.
Right.
So
Still does.
He does. I know. Yeah, he's coming to Bend in a month from now, June 10th.
wow.
You gonna go?
I kind of want to, but I'm sure tickets are going to be like really expensive. And that's the concert with Nick Lowe opening. So that would-
Oh,
yeah,
that'd be
that would be fun. I'll see. Maybe I can get cheap tickets somehow. But it's on a Saturday
Hustle.
too, which would work.
gotta hustle.
Yeah, Josh.
Yeah. Sell my plasma.
There you go. Do it for the write it off for the show. Business expense. So all right. So what we'll end each of these segments with is the track stay in the buzz bin or get discarded from the buzz bin?
Oh, it's
What do you
staying
think?
in my buzz bin.
Yeah, it's
How about-
staying. If I heard this, I would want to hear the rest of the album. So it is buzzworthy.
Maybe that's the criteria we can use. Like,
Yeah.
does this cause you to want to explore the artist and or listen to the album? That'll
Yeah.
be the definitive criteria. So that's awesome, John. I would say the same. This
I
would
give
make
it
me
5
wanna hear that
Bs.
album. 5 B's. Yeah. The B's.
5
B's.
honey pots.
Well, there we go. So, all right. Well, this segment will continue to be a part of it because we do think the Buzz Clips is something that does speak to this era of music we're going into. And they lasted from 1988 until 2003. So we will probably continue to track Buzz Clips as we go along. So there you go.
Nice.
And that leads us into our first album. And I believe the first take on that album is going to be Matt. So, Matt, why don't you not only introduce the album, but run the numbers for us?
All right, so
And
the
take the tape.
Pixies. Yeah, the Pixies for the first time. We're covering their album Surfer Rosa. It comes in at number 12 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 2 in 1988, number 95 of all time, and it's the Pixies' second highest rated album behind 1989's Doolittle, which we are going to cover next week. It's the only album that we're covering tonight that made Rolling Stone's list, comes in at number 390 there, and the Pixies are ranked number 17 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums. We're actually covering 3 artists tonight in the top 50 of all time
Whoa.
on
Wow.
Best Ever Albums. So yeah, New Kids on the Block, not one of them. Spoiler alert.
I would have been very surprised.
Yes. So, the Pixies, I've known of them for many years. I probably think I first heard them through Kurt Cobain. I think he referenced them in an interview as being an influential band, and I was like, who the hell are the Pixies? But I probably never really got to know them until the late 90s, early 2000s, where I started hearing some of their music, particularly I think maybe I first heard Where Is My Mind, which is on this record at the end of Fight Club,
Yes,
which is a
same.
great use of a song. And
That is
really
how
one of
you
the-
guys found out about the Pixies, huh?
Yep.
Fight Club?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I found out about them through Kurt Cobain, but I first started hearing them around that time.
But you
and
didn't explore the band. You just were
Correct.
like, oh, that's it. Okay,
Correct.
gotcha.
Again,
No,
this
that-
is the
yeah.
again, this is the time where, in order to explore a band, you had to, particularly a band like the Pixies that weren't on the radio, you had to go out and buy the album, right? And it's not just
Or
you
have
can't
cooler
just-
friends that would make you mixtapes.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, my friends were not giving me mixtapes of the Pixies. That's correct. But I do remember that from the end of Fight Club, which is one of my all-time favorite uses of songs in movies. But so I knew a lot of these songs, but I don't know if I've ever listened to Surfer Rosa back to front the way we did this week. And I'm no surprise, I really liked it. And this is a great example of a band that's covering both the edgy kind of like a little chaotic nature of music, experimental, discordant at times, but also melodic and really cool, beats and bass lines and drum fills that really kind of brings everything together into a beautiful, record that it was easily, one of those albums that's ahead of its time. You can hear a lot of 90s alt rock, in this record. It makes sense. Yes, of course. Now I knew Nirvana was kind of around this time. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the Pixies' debut album.
It is.
So they're kind of around at the same time, but the Pixies certainly developed a sound and a structure, kind of a structure to their music that lasted for many years after this and influenced a lot of people. So I also think I saw that Steve Albini produced this record, who was also a seminal 90s producer. So that tracks as well, that he's part of this. But yeah, as a breezy 33-minute long album, this is great. Songs like Bone Machine, Gigantic, those are really great songs with there's some really cool guitar riffs on here. And Where Is My Mind is just that is an awesome song with the guitar part and the Kim Deal oohs that she's doing in the background that are just that might be my favorite Pixie song, actually. I'll have to juxtapose it against some of the other stuff that we're going to cover later on, but I've always loved that song. They got some of the banter. There's some skits going on here, and I think I read that Albini just recorded the band and just didn't even tell them that they were putting some of those little stories and bits on there. So that's just kind of something that he threw in there. And yeah, man, it's a great record. There's punk in here. There's
ska.
And drum fills and stuff like that. Yeah, a little bit of that, a little bit of but a good, tasteful, a tasteful amount of ska.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, Pixies are great, and I'm glad I listened to a full record to see kind of like the full idea kind of come out. And they've, Frank Black it's Black Francis, it's Frank Black. I don't know. I'm interested. I'm covering them. I'm doing the bio next week, so I'm going to learn more. And I know they are from.
It's both.
It's both, right? So I'm covering them, and I know they met in Massachusetts here, which is where I live. So get to know a little bit about that. But yeah, man, this is great. They're really an interesting band. I've seen them live a couple of times as well, and they put on really good shows. So yeah, how can I not be thumbs up on the Pixies? So yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that hearing them in Fight Club is definitely the first time I heard them. I was not exposed to. I was like all in on ska. That's like all my exposure in high school, and I didn't and that was the first time I was like into music. So I did not hear about the Pixies until later, and I definitely heard that song in Fight Club. And yeah, this band is great. This album is great. It's like kind of everything I want from like an indie rock album. In some ways, it's almost like what I want Sonic Youth to be in terms of like sound or kind of what I expected them to be like. Kind of, they're not just straight ahead rock and roll. They've got some feedback in there, but it's not too much. They've got like a punk rock kind of lo-fi spirit, even though the album doesn't sound like that, in terms of production. And they're rough around the edges, but almost like intentionally so. But they're also like they're already like really good out of the gate as a band in terms of like their playing and their sound. They seem like they know who they are right away. And the album is like, it's got a variety of different things that you can, looking back now, see has like influenced so many people, including Nirvana, clearly, because even the first song sounds like Nirvana, just in terms of how Black Francis sings and with Kim Deal on harmonies. Also, they're like Sonic Youth in my mind, because Kim Deal is also singing, as a counterpoint to Black Francis in the same way that Kim Gordon is with with Thurston Moore, but I like Kim Deal singing a lot more, and I like her harmonies, and just her voice is, not as subdued or monotone, I think, as how I hear
I agree
Kim
with you
Gordon
there, Josh. Yeah.
And I just imagine her as more of like almost like a punk rock girl, even though a woman, or I don't know anything about her, but that's kind of how I picture her in the band. And
she's a lot more like Riot Girl energy in practice than maybe punk rock.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's also appealing to me. and those bands, that would come in the 90s, and obviously she went on to the Breeders, which is kind of like that too. Although, to be fair, I don't really know much Breeders music, so maybe like Hole and like all those other bands, and Bikini Kill, and many others that I can't think of right now, but
L7,
yeah, and Elastica, although
Throwing
are they Riot
Muses?
Girl? I don't know.
No, Throwing Muses, right? Tanya Donnelly. I think that's another. Yeah.
But this is it's really great. It goes on that edge of sometimes being abrasive too, but not going too far to take me out of it. It's like a lot of the punk rock that really works for me in that way as well, in terms of tone. And I could see people being maybe annoyed by Black Francis's voice and singing, but it works here for the band. And I think this is just a really strong debut for them. I know some of the other songs from, I know Doolittle more, but again, I didn't hear that until much later. And so this is great. This can be high on my rankings for an album, and it's something I hope to go back to. So thumbs up for me as well.
I'm going to be a little bit more of a contrarian take on this album. I don't dislike this album. I like this album. Mm-hmm. I don't love this album, though. I think this is a very scattershot album to some degree. So like, to give you some musings that I have, I like this band a lot more when Kim Deal's the front woman. I actually think and I know that Black Francis writes the songs, but I don't know if the song lyrics and the songwriting is a strength in some ways of this band. Now the music, right, and the melody and stuff is very interesting, and the chance taking is there, but I think when people are like, oh, you like this person sing, but they don't write the songs, I don't know if that's really a negative for me. And the songs I like Gigantic, are the ones that Kim Deal wrote, right? Mm-hmm. So like, I wonder how much that's a big deal. No pun intended, along the way. What I think is, I know you guys said, I think like narratives really get set. And once a narrative gets set, and like one of these narratives is like, well, like there were the Pixies, and then the Pixies led to Nirvana with Loud Soft, right? And then like Nirvana led to, and I just think people keep saying it, and there's truth to it. But like what really stood out to me was how much the Pixies are a descendant of all of these different bands that I didn't know going into the podcast, that now I do, where I'm like, oh shit, like this is who they were listening to. Like Pere Ubu and Pylon and Husker Du. And I'm like, my God, these guys were just doing Pere Ubu and Husker Du and Pylon, right? Just
right.
They edged it forward in the Minutemen, right? Like there's all these bands we covered, right? That they were similar to. There's even a lot of like the Violent Femmes, which I actually feel the Violent Femmes is a better Pixies in some ways, in terms of at least this album of the Pixies. And so that's what really stood out to me. Like, oh shit, like I did not have enough musical knowledge of the lineage to kind of see I probably would have said something like, well, the Pixies kind of came from Sonic Youth and avant-garde loosely, right? Like, but not really knowing what avant-garde I was going on, like art rock into Sonic Youth, maybe a little bit of Jesus and Mary Chain type music, and then you get the Pixies, right? But like, I'm like, no, really, the Sonic lineage is, yes, Sonic Youth and the Pixies share commonalities, but I think they share a lot more commonalities with those other bands that I was just talking about. Mission of Burma, right, is another band we listen to that has elements. So like, there's Gun Club, right? Like, I'd keep going.
All
right?
bands
like,
I like that you've named. So
yeah, that's what I'm saying. But like, they're the lineage of it,
right.
And so like in that lineage, And you know, and people sort of forget that, like, yes, the Pixies were one Kurt Cobain thing, but like, you know, Come As You Are is a Killing Joke song. Basically, it's a Killing Joke riff, right? You know, and then there's like the Meat Puppets who they covered,
Or
and,
the Raincoats.
you know, yeah, or the Raincoat, right? There's all these people there that are part of, and so like I just feel like there's like a thing with like critics and people who listen to music that's like, I heard this thing and I'm gonna ride this horse till it's dead. And one of the things I love is that now that we've listened to a lot of music, like I don't have to buy into things that don't hit my ears as clean anymore. So that was like really my first thought.
Well, it's like an easy analogy without thinking that the Pixies are the beginning when really they're just a continuation of all this.
Well, and people parrot it to seem smart, and also not everybody can take 3.5 years and listen to all these albums that lead up to it. So I totally get it. But like, I think critics are guilty sometimes of making it seem like they did stuff like this, when in reality, maybe they didn't do as much of this, right? Maybe they just cribbed the notes and like they found a thing that locked, and then it was sort of like hive mind a little bit, right? But now, with that being said, and I guess what I'm getting at is that because of that, this didn't stand out as like, oh, this is a transcendent album that pushed the bar forward as much as I might have thought it would have. Now, we've got 2 or 3 Pixies albums there, and don't get me wrong, this album absolutely presages like many things that are coming in the 90s and pushes some of what we were talking about forward. But there's a reason the Pixies stayed obscure enough that you were only finding out about them in Fight Club or through Kurt Cobain's liner notes, right? Because it really wasn't till Nirvana that somebody sort of took this sound. And I mean, and candidly, Sonic Youth was probably a bigger band than the Pixies were from 88 to 91 in terms of breaking through. Because,
well, you know, they've been around a lot longer too.
Well, but also they broke through in terms of like having top 20 singles in alt rock quicker. Right? You know, the Pixies were huge in England, but in America, much like when we talked about Elvis Costello there, like they were more critic than they were pop chart, right? Whereas stuff like that. So I love the song Vamos. I've always enjoyed that song. You know,
I like the bass drum on that, how it starts.
Yeah. And the bass parts are really appealing here. I do like the fact that there's a ton of variety in terms of song structure. There's, you know, some songs that are close to 4 minutes, and then there's ones that are very adjacent to like hardcore music, where it's like a minute and 30 seconds, a minute and 48 seconds. Those, I don't dislike them, but they seem to be more. I think Black Francis said something in the research I saw that like he liked to imagine his songs as like a brief conversation because he hates long songs, which he and I can both agree on this concept, which I'm a fan of. And yeah, that brisk pace of the album was appealing. But yeah, while I like this album, a lot of the songs that I think of as my favorite Pixie songs are not on this album. So like we'll revisit them. With that being said, Where's My Mind's an absolute classic. Gigantic is a great song. I know Bone Machine is popular. I'm neutral on Bone Machine, I'd say. I think because the lyrics are so inane, it's hard for me to get behind it. I mentioned Vamos, the song I like. The song, I think the deep cut on this, whenever I listen to this album, is Cactus, is the song that's sort of the deep cut for me. It's a very interesting song. It's a hard song to explain. And it hits at a very interesting time because it's directly after Where Is My Mind, which is probably the slickest song, that or Gigantic, on this entire album. And then Cactus sort of comes along and changes the tone a little bit. So I definite thumbs up.
Cactus kind of has like the Spy versus Spy, like dun 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 dun, you know, like that. That it's not exactly that, but there's a little bit of that riff going on.
Peter Gunn theme is the actual song.
Yeah, there you go. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it. But yeah, I think if you had talked to me 3 years ago when we started this podcast, I would have thought that my answer about this album would have been, oh man, this is where alt rock becomes alt rock. And what really stood out to me about this was how much the narrative that I'd sort of been given. There's elements of it that are true, they're right, but how that is just a small piece of the sonic lineage of this album. And I kind of, at the risk of patting ourselves on the back, I really think, for me at least this week, this seemed like where you start to read a lot more history than what people tell you is the history, and you start to get a more complex view of history that doesn't diminish things but puts them into context a little bit better.
Yeah,
So,
I totally see what you're saying, and you're right, because and that's something I alluded to a
thanks,
little bit. I
Matt.
was
That's
like,
all we need from you. So, yeah.
Podcast over.
But like, yeah, because I was thinking, like, this is their first album, and it's only 1988, and yeah, Nirvana's kind of, it's not like Nirvana comes 5 years later, right? Like that they're
They
right
come
around there.
a year later with
Yeah,
Reach.
it's
So
but
it's
they're
not
but
even
they're
that far removed.
and the ideas are happening. Kurt Cobain's probably like getting the ideas of, and bands that he's been into, like the Raincoats, have been around for many years. So that kind of seed has been planted already. And you're right. There's plenty of those other bands that we've covered that when we heard, we're like, man, I can't believe this is 1980. Like 6 years ago. So certainly the seeds are being planted there. And I think that's kind of just an interesting side note, which is like, how did the Pixies become that band, right? Because that is more of the narrative, when Kurt Cobain was also referencing a lot of other bands that were around way before. So it just goes back to how does like a certain band that does a very similar thing to another band, why does the one become a bigger legend or a bigger cult following, and the other one becomes way more obscure? And it's always interesting how stuff like that it just seems like it happens, or somebody decides, like you said, somebody gets this idea and runs with it, and then it just kind of takes off like that.
Well, we're also go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, Matt, you're saying like Nirvana becomes this big band versus the Pixies not becoming this big.
No,
band?
I'm saying
big band,
Pixies.
yeah.
Well, no, I'm saying the Pixies almost became like a big cult band that has this narrative.
Yeah.
But there are bands like John said, like Pylon, right, or Mission of
that
Burma,
are much more like obscure, I guess.
that you might have even heard of, but there's no way that where it's like, oh, Pylon, the way that they do the Pixies, because the Pixies become this band where everybody's like, it becomes a cool band because
compared with Nirvana, like.
But I'll give you my take on that. I think what happened was there were really this idea, like up until like the late 80s in some ways. Like what happened was there was mainstream music and then there was underground music, and you were in those lanes, right? And what happened was there were sort of out of the clear blue around like 1983, right? Some of these bands that were destined to be underground, right? Or like, not mainstream, started to like get into the mainstream a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So then there was the second layer of lesser appreciated bands. And so instead of those bands being appreciated, right? Like they still existed in that. And then what happened is all these bands that started to break through that in like 83, right? From the subculture, like REM or Metallica or the Chili Peppers, all that stuff, like they hit the late 80s, and everybody, like critic mind, right, like starts saying they sold out, right? So like they still existed, and a lot of people still thought of them as being edgy, right? But for the true heads, right, like they had sold out. So then you had this other group of bands, right? And they're kind of under it. But then some of them get popular, right? Like Nirvana and stuff. But then others don't rise to that level, right?
Yeah.
Like the Pixies. And what the Pixies had going for them is they only ran from 1988 to 1991. And so they were gone before they went through that cycle of critical darling to like trying to stay around and make money. And I think that is how the Pixies became the Pixies, right? And that like they became famous enough that you could put them in Fight Club, but also never broke through enough that you could make them an inspirational story. Does that make sense?
Yes, but it also just is like what constitutes breaking through, right? Because there's been other bands that we've covered that we've never heard of or that we didn't really know that much about. And it's like, well, what was the difference really? Like, why didn't this, because this sounds like something that would have been able to break through even in an earlier time. So I guess that's just what I'm saying is like similar things can happen, and it's not just underground acts, it's popular acts too. There's plenty of like acts, and we're going to cover some of them that are like, man, I can't believe this wasn't a big, this has all the ingredients for a big massive band, and they just never got to that status. And I'm just always fascinated by like what specifically, and I don't know if I've ever really gotten a great answer, because it just seems like there's some sort of a combination of like some recipe or whatever that
it's the time too. It's the times. You know what I mean? Like, you couldn't have been a new metal band in 1991 or in 2008, but you could be in 1999. You couldn't have been Nirvana and on the charts in 1983 or 2002, but you could in 1991. There's a lot of that too, right?
Yeah,
like,
that-
are
Sure.
you like
That's
the
absolutely
swing
part of it.
revival? If you were a swing band in 1993 or in 2001, you were fucked. But in like 1996 through 1999,
Right.
you nailed it. Yeah. So it's a little
If you
bit
were
of
on the Swinger
accident.
soundtrack, you were golden.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's there's always that alchemy, right? And then I think it gets to Matt, what you were saying or questioning is like, I think the short-lived nature of the band too, that plays into why they didn't get bigger, because there was no way.
Star power too.
No
Like
way to
Kurt
build it.
Cobain's a handsome, creative, you know what I mean? Like huge presence, right? Like in a way that these other bands are. Like, why was No Doubt the ska band that broke through? Well, Gwen Stefani, right? You know, that's like there's others if you blind test them, right? That sound exactly like her, you know, like that sound, right?
Yep.
But why did Blink-182 and No Doubt break through? Because they had a star charisma to them, right? That like some of these others didn't.
that's true.
And that's like Nirvana had the star charisma in Kurt Cobain, and later Dave Grohl, right? That like the Pixies did not. Like their star, right, was Kim Deal, but
Yeah.
like if you look at pictures of them, right, like Black Francis tried to like minimize Kim Deal, right, their like de facto star, right, and also they dressed in like oversized t-shirts and stuff, whereas people say grunge was grungy, but Kurt Cobain had a clear style, right, and trendsetter. So like there's that too, like that
Yeah.
you can't overlook star power.
Yeah, the marketing, the attractiveness of the band always plays into, I think, to an extent for how big they can get. Also, I get
Why'd the Lemonheads have a career and Big Star didn't, Matt? Like, what's the difference, right?
Right.
Like Evan Dando.
Yeah, I think
That like they could have been bigger. Like Lemonheads could have been, because they were right. They had the sound at the time.
Well,
and
but
they
their
had
problem
biggest,
was they were making music that you couldn't be that pretty. You know what I mean? So they could be
No,
popular
but I'm saying,
enough because he was that,
but musically, their biggest hit was a cover of Simon and Garfunkel. You know what I mean?
Right.
But they had other songs that were very much in the lane at the time, with a good-looking dude that was kind of like, had this long hair and like, he
But
was.
there's a limit to that as well. Like, look at Bush. Like, you could sell a zillion albums, but you can't get taken seriously, right? Like, if you have the handsome.
Yeah,
parents,
it's a
right?
combination
Yeah.
of everything, but it's like, certain bands that you're like, man, that band should have been big. Like I always said, Matthew Sweet should have been big. Like he was just like, he had so many great songs. And at the time when that type of sound was very popular, but he just never got bigger than that Girlfriend song,
Well, and he has negative star charisma compared to somebody
Exactly.
like John Mayer,
Yeah.
right? Who had more star charisma. Yeah,
Yeah, he could have dated Taylor Swift too. That would have helped.
sure.
I think the final thing that I found interesting about the Pixies is just now knowing where they are on the timeline. I never think of them. I always just thought of
fair.
them in the past, somewhere nebulously in the 90s, floating around whenever I heard about them or read about them. But now knowing that they're late 80s, it's just kind of, it puts more context into things. So I found that interesting as well.
And
Great
such a
album.
brief,
Great
brief
album.
moment of time.
Yeah, great album cover too.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
Not safe for work.
Definitely not safe for work, but yeah.
So, all right. So 3 thumbs up on this one, and pretty good conversation, I think.